As one of the biggest media franchises in the world, Star Wars has spawned multiple films, books, comics, games, and a whole lot else. And thanks to the sheer volume of Star Wars-related stuff out there, it goes without saying that not all of it is good. That stands true for Star Wars video games as well. And though there have been a number of great Star Wars games in the past, and will be in the future, hopefully, there's also been some pretty terrible ones. And in this feature, we'll be talking about the worst of the worst. So let's get started with the most obvious choice. KINECT Star Wars. Basically, almost anything with KINECT's ill-formed motion controls shoehorned in was a bad idea, but doing so with something as massive as Star Wars was monumentally baffling. Not only did the game make the mistake of not having responsive and accurate controls, it was also just a very rushed product, feeling more like a collection of minigames than anything else. Worst of all was the Dance Central style dancing game, which, why did that even exist? Star Wars The Force Unleashed 2. The first Force Unleashed game was a flawed but great experience, and the hope was that the sequel would improve upon it to deliver an even better experience. The opposite of that ended up happening, with The Force Unleashed 2 turning out to be a massive disappointment. A nonsense story, flat and boring gameplay, and a lack of technical polish came together to make for an uninspired and repetitive experience. Star Wars Demolition. When you think of Star Wars games, you hope for great stories, thrilling combat, and the ability to use force powers, as well as seeing some striking sights the series is so well known for. Star Wars Demolition had none of that. It was instead a twisted metal vehicular knockoff, and though it might have still been an enjoyable experience if it was well made, it didn't even manage to do that. The combat was boring, the gameplay repetitive, the game suffered from poor controls, and the entire thing just felt like a terrible idea. Star Wars The Clone Wars Republic Heroes. The Clone Wars Republic Heroes is essentially a LEGO game, except it's not good and it's not fun. It's got clunky, unresponsive platforming, the combat is dull and bland, and the whole experience just feels like a package that's been hastily put together without any regard for whether or not it's any fun. There's also the fact that it looks terrible, which is only the cherry on top of the unappetizing and tasteless sundae that is this game. Star Wars Flight of the Falcon. The Rogue Squadron games are ample evidence to support the notion that there can be great Star Wars flight combat games. But on the other end of the spectrum is the GBA exclusive Flight of the Falcon. Frustrating controls, horrible performance issues, drab level design all come together to make for a vastly disappointing experience that is best left untouched. Star Wars Masters of TERAS. There's certainly an inherent appeal to the concept of a fighting game based on Star Wars, but Masters of TERAS squandered that potential of its premise in the most horrible way possible. Not only did it have a disappointing story, it was, worst of all, also a bad fighting game at its core, with poor controls, shoddy movement, and uninteresting moves and combos. It was a disappointing Star Wars game and a bad fighting game, which is the worst possible thing one can say about a Star Wars fighting game. Star Wars Yoda Stories, Game Boy Color version. Making a game centered around Yoda sounds like an excellent idea, but in spite of its name, Yoda Stories wasn't really centered around Yoda. It was also a bad-looking game, with dull and uninteresting randomly generated levels that more often than not had very little to do. There wasn't even an interesting story to dive into. It was essentially one of the most pointless and boring Star Wars games ever made. Episode 1 Racer, Game Boy Color version. Episode 1 Racer was actually a decent racing game, much to everyone's surprise, but its Game Boy Color version was, well, not. In its transition to a top-down view, it lost its sense of speed, while also looked pretty bad in general, which was understandable given the hardware limitations. The camera perspective also did not really support fast-paced racing, and all in all, it just felt like a misguided attempt to get a game released on every possible platform. Star Wars Jedi Arena. Much of Jedi Arena's issues stem from the fact that it was on a piece of hardware that was less powerful than an electric toothbrush. But even if you keep its visual deficiencies aside, it's still a pretty boring and pointless game. There's nothing to do other than waving a sorry excuse for something that's supposed to be a lightsaber to hit a giant square thingy, because this is how Luke trains, apparently. Yeah, it was a mess. Star Wars Rebel Assault. Both Rebel Assault games belong on this list, actually. They were terrible-looking excuses for games, with shoddy FMV cutscenes crammed into the experience for no good reason, and boring on-rail shooting sequences. The passage of time has only served to make these games look even worse, with everything from poorly shot and directed cutscenes to the visuals making it look like a low-budget knockoff than an actual Star Wars licensed product. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from Gaming Bolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.